Centuries ago, the Netherlands was a collection of relatively independent states in northwestern Europe, and they were ruled by the Lord of the Netherlands. In the 16th century, this was the King of Spain, Felipe II. When he became Lord, the king ignored the constitutions of the states and undermined local governments to increase his power. The king was also a fierce Roman Catholic with an intense hatred for heretics, aka Protestants. Like his father, Emperor Charles V, he used the Inquisition to condemn and execute these heretics. The Dutch did not appreciate any of this and revolted against their lord. Their rebellion set off the 80 Years' War. Once the rebels gained control of the harbors, they gradually pushed the Spanish army out of the states of Holland, Zeeland, and beyond. The northern states removed the king from power, and they eventually became a republic, the Republic of the United States of the Seven Netherlands. The war was funded by taxed income from trade. The Dutch were excellent sailors, and the Netherlands had a strong trading economy. Trade routes to the east had always been a highly guarded secret of the Portuguese, and their territories were protected by the Pope. But when King Felipe of Spain also became King of Portugal, he banished the Dutch merchants from the Portuguese harbors and cut them off from the spice trade. The merchants then decided to cut out the middleman and find their own way east. They ended up finding a quicker route. Instead of hugging the coasts, they caught the Roaring Forties, a jet stream further south. The current moved so fast that captains were warned to pay attention and turn left in time. If they didn't, they'd wind up crashing on the coral reefs of an unexplored territory known only as Terra Australis, meaning the Southland. That's right, Australia. Dutch merchants made more and more trade deals with rivaling East Indian rulers. They gradually pushed out the Portuguese and Spanish merchants by being the more courteous and more helpful people to the locals. At first, anyway. The competition between the Dutch shipping companies was so fierce that it drove up buying prices and drove down selling prices. This bidding war lowered profit margins and reduced war chest contributions. The Dutch government solved this problem by uniting all the rivaling shipping companies into one big trading company, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, the Dutch United East India Company. Not to be confused with the English one on which it was based. This organization was also part of the Republic's war machine. The government ordered the company's heavily armed merchant vessels to destroy Spanish and Portuguese ships wherever they encountered them. Bonds and shares were issued to the general public, so the company could invest in ships and trading posts. They were the first publicly listed company in the world, paving the way for modern corporations, the direct descendants of the VOC. The company was ruthless in its hunt for profits. Over time, the VOC held the monopoly in the spice trade and, with its massive profit margins, became the wealthiest company to exist in the world ever, to this day. Overseas, the company behaved as if it was a country. It had the right to declare and wage war, imprison and execute convicts, negotiate treaties, and establish colonies. The VOC employees also studied languages to bring the Christian faith to the unknown peoples, and they studied botany because the local plants killed its workers. Over the years, the company added many ports and trading bases, annexing surrounding territories, not by asking nicely. The Verenigde West-Indische Compagnie was founded for trade on the West Indies, the Americas, and they eventually got involved in the slave trade. The East India Company was no stranger to slavery, as they forced entire East Indian nations to work for them in the spice fields for free. The VOC was run by a board called De Heren 17, the 17 Gentlemen. The members hailed from different harbor towns. The 17 decided everything: which ships would be built, which routes would be taken, who became captain of what vessel, and which merchants would get which assignments. Once the company board had determined a destination and assigned a ship, they appointed an upper merchant. He was responsible for all the cargo on board. They picked an under merchant who was in charge of buying and selling cargo. And they selected a captain, the skipper of the ship. While the captain was responsible for all the nautical stuff, the upper merchant was ultimately in charge, and the captain had to take orders from him. Our story starts with a destination, Batavia, a town which the locals call Jayakarta, modern-day Jakarta on the island of Java in Indonesia. When sailor and explorer Cornelis de Houtman first arrived in Jayakarta, it was a town of 3,000 people protected by nothing more than a bamboo wall. Outside the town, the VOC built a factory to prepare spices for shipping, and so did the English. The local rulers played the Dutch and English traders off against each other, and they got the popcorn. The Dutch burned the English factory to the ground, the English burned the Dutch factory to the ground, then the Dutch overthrew the Javanese ruler who had sided with the English and pretty much leveled the town. The company rebuilt the old settlement into a large walled fort with a defensive castle, the Citadel, and made it their headquarters. They renamed Jayakarta Batavia, the name which the Romans had given to an ancient Dutch tribe, the Batavi. All the company factories, from Arabia to the coast of Japan, were ruled by a governor-general. This most senior merchant was appointed by the company to ensure profits, using both diplomatic and military means. His powers rivaled kings. The Governor-General lived at Company HQ in Batavia, where he presided over the Council of the Indies, consisting of 8 senior merchants. The company hired soldiers to protect their trading posts and factories. They were unruly mercenaries who were aware that the very survival of the colonies rested on their shoulders. They repeatedly broke every company rule. They fought, drank, and whored their way through their 5-year tour of duty with no fear of getting fired. It was difficult to find soldiers willing to serve in the East, and the company couldn't afford to lose any of them. Only a fierce governor-general could control this rowdy bunch. The current governor, 41-year-old Jan Pieterszoon Koen, was an absolute delight and a sweetheart. Of course he wasn't. The God-fearing Koen was the fiercest governor-general of them all, brutal, inflexible, harsh, and unpleasant. Koen's unprecedented ruthlessness caused the VOC many headaches over the years. A major political riot involving the dubious execution of a group of Englishmen even threatened to ignite a war between the Dutch and English back home. To defuse the conflict, the company fired Koen for a short while. The VOC couldn't live without him, and they reinstated him. The English can suck it. When Koen returned to his post, Batavia was under threat from the Empire of Mataram and its extremely ambitious ruler, Sultan Agung. The Susu-Hunan wanted a piece of all that Batavia money. In August 1628, the Sultan besieged Batavia with an army of over 10,000 men. It forced Koen to burn down a big part of the town and retreat to the citadel. After 3 months, Agung ran out of supplies and he had to break off the siege. But he would be back next year. Koen was sure of it. With the destination Batavia set, the 17 now needed a ship. At massive docks all over the coast, Dutch shipbuilders continually built new VOC ships. They introduced standardized designs and components to mass-produce ships in record time. These were highly sophisticated vessels, far superior in design, capacity, and functionality to the ones used by the English and the Portuguese. The company had many different sizes of ships in their vast fleet. The largest of these was called a spiegelretourschip, or a return ship. These were large, sturdy vessels that would sail back and forth between the Netherlands and the East. They shipped supplies, personnel, and immigrants to the trading posts. They were built to last. These return ships cost 100,000 guilders to build, nearly $3 million today. But these vessels earned back their investments several times over, and after a service of about 20 years and some 6 round trips, they would be disassembled, and all the wood recycled. In 1626, the 17 issued a charter to build the largest return ship so far, the Batavia. She was built at the Peperwerf in Amsterdam, the largest and most efficient wharf in Europe. The Batavia was a mighty ship in every sense of the word. She was 160 feet long, the maximum allowable length by company regulations. Her triple hull stretched 40 feet above the waterline. She had an outer shell made of pine to protect the ship from being eaten up by shipworms before she reached her destination. Painted green, red, and gold, the Batavia had 4 decks, 3 masts, and 30 cannons. The company kept a tight budget, and they were cheap, all to maximize profits. But they allowed a few extravagances to impress the locals, such as a ferocious carved lion on her bow and an elaborately decorated stern with carvings of famous Dutch military leaders. The ship had room for 300 people, or more if that was doable. The Batavia was scheduled to depart with the Fall Fleet, one of the 3 organized fleets each year. The convoy was scheduled to set sail on October 26, 1628. The 18-ship armada would make the 15,000 miles journey east under the command of Jacques Spex, a member of the Council of the Indies and one of the company's most senior and experienced traders. The trip would take about 9 months if the winds were favorable. The Batavia had a destination and a fleet. Now the 17 appointed an upper merchant, an under merchant, and a captain. The spice trade yielded obscene wealth. For some, the merchants at home profited the most from the import and export of goods. The ship's crews and those operating and defending the colonies received low salaries, no pensions, and hardly ever a bonus. VOC personnel's life expectancy in the Indies was less than 3 years because of diseases, diets, and dangers. You had to be pretty tough to make it out there, and pretty desperate. Those employed by the company were not the cream of the crop. Its sailors and soldiers were violent rogues. Its merchants were often broke people, willing to risk everything for a chance at restoring their wealth and standing. Francisco Pelsart was such a man. His family had wealth, but he did not. He was raised by his grandfather, who taught him how to behave in the upper classes and also taught him bookkeeping. He introduced the young Pelsart to the VOC Zeeland chamber. When his grandfather died, nothing was keeping Pelsart in the Netherlands, so he applied for a job there. But there was one problem. Pelsart hailed from Antwerpen in the south and was a Roman Catholic. The 80 Years' War was being waged between the rebel north and the obedient south, and the VOC only hired Protestants. So Pelsart was like, "Sure, I'm Protestant, and go rebels!" And the 17 were like, "You're hired!" When he was 20, Pelsart started as a company assistant, the lowest merchant rank, and made his first trip east. 5 years later, he was promoted to under merchant, the second in command. Stationed at Surat, India, he had to help establish trade with the Mughal emperors, who were so rich that, well, they were Mughals. Pelsart became fluent in Hindustani and had a working knowledge of Persian. He was one of the company's most vigorous and efficient servants. Unlike the other guys, he spent time with the locals and wrote extensive reports about them. These reports greatly benefited the company. Another 4 years later, Pelsart was promoted to upper merchant, the highest rank. He got a significant salary bump and was now in command of the office at Agra and the trade negotiations at the Mughal court. The frugal VOC allowed Pelsart to live extravagantly at the court because it was necessary to impress his hosts. Pelsart had 2 loves in his life: the ladies and money. His flirtations got him in hot water more than a few times, and some of his affairs even threatened his career and his life. Like most merchants, he slept with local servants and slaves. But he took it a step further and had affairs with local women of the highest noble classes. One such lady was at Pelsart's home one night and downed a bottle of clove oil, thinking it was wine. She dropped dead at Pelsart's feet. He secretly buried the woman, and none were the wiser, except for one man who blackmailed the VOC with the intel, and the company paid him handsomely to keep him quiet. Living on meager salaries while making enormous profits for their bosses, you can imagine that VOC personnel found different ways to make more money behind the company's back. Private trade, fraud, corruption, and bribery ran rampant. You just had to be careful you didn't get caught. The punishments were severe. Pelsart did all of it, but private trade, fraud, and money lending were his main things. It was easy to commit fraud. Personal belongings were frequently searched, but fraudulent accounting was not checked. The merchant bought goods at a low price, claimed they had cost more, and pocketed the difference. In 1626, Pelsart's 3-year contract with the VOC was up. Despite being one of the most successful merchants, the company didn't offer him an extension. Perhaps this was because Pelsart was not much of a diplomat, or maybe because the political climate in India had changed. He was still adjusting to the new situation when another man got his job at twice the salary. Pelsart was furious and deeply insulted. Despite pleas to stay, the upper merchant went home to talk to the 17 in person. 6 months later, Pelsart arrived safe and sound in the Netherlands and talked his way back on a mission. Just a few months later, with his reputation salvaged, he was sent on a special assignment to India. Pelsart would sail east with the Batavia, and on the way over, he would be her upper merchant. A little later, the board sent a letter addressed to Governor-General Koen, recommending Pelsart for a higher office once he arrived in Batavia. Because we have heard very good reports of his previous service, we therefore recommend him to your honor, hereby asking you to keep in mind this person and advance the said Pelsart to such a position as his conduct and quality shall merit. There were no tests or exams to get hired by the VOC. The only requirements were not bankrupt, not Catholic, not infamous. But even these rules were rarely enforced. Since only the hopeless and penniless applied, the 17 couldn't be overly selective. The board hired the 30-year-old Hieronymus Corneliszoon as an undermerchant, the second in command. Hieronymus had only recently applied for a job with the VOC. He was no merchant, had no connections in the East, and never had plans to go to sea. Hieronymus was educated, refined, and moved among the upper classes of the United States. In society, he would outrank everyone aboard the ship, including the upper merchant. Why would he humiliate himself by joining the riffraff? Why did he think he could survive the brutal living conditions out there? Why was he signing on? Well, like all who dared to venture east, Hieronymus was a desperate man. Like his father, he was an apothecary. Originally from Friesland, Hieronymus moved to Haarlem in Holland, established his practice, and got married. When the war with Spain restarted after a 12-year truce, the economy took a nosedive and new businesses like Hieronymus's had a tough time keeping afloat. To make matters worse, his wife, Beleidgen Jacobsdochter van der Knas, was pregnant, but she became terribly ill and nearly died. The midwife they hired was an incompetent woman who messed up the delivery, and Beleidgen got an infection. She could not take care of her son, and they had to hire a wet nurse to feed the baby. Not the best pick either. The woman had syphilis and passed it on to the child. Hieronymus' son died soon after. In those days, if a baby died of syphilis, it meant that one of the parents had been sleeping around. Adultery was frowned upon by the respectable classes, and Hieronymus' reputation tanked. Also, customers, fearing they might catch something from the apothecary, stayed away from his store. Hieronymus desperately tried to clear his name and save his business by gathering evidence and witnesses to take the syphilitic nurse to court, but eventually he had to sell most of his store to his creditors. Bankruptcy was a mortal sin in the Netherlands, and so to avoid it, the apothecary closed shop. Hieronymus was now broke and unemployed, but his troubles were not over. The painter Johannes van der Beek, also known as Torrentius, had been arrested and was being tortured. Torrentius, like many young men at the time, lived a depraved and debauched life, but he made the mistake of bragging about it. He claimed that adultery was not a sin, that there was no such thing as hell, and that the Bible was a fairy tale. He was not an atheist, but a Gnostic, who believed that each man had a spark of the divine in them. But back in the day, that meant one thing: he was a heretic. After a sham trial, Torrentius was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment for heresy and being a threat to society. Haarlem banished all those in Torrentius' circle from the town, and the town council gave them a few weeks to settle their affairs and leave. At this time, Hieronymus settled his affairs and prepared to leave Haarlem. Did he belong to the circle? It appeared that Hieronymus shared Torrentius' ideas, but he took it a few steps further. A few miles further. He believed that whatever he did was inspired by God. God wasn't evil, therefore whatever he did wasn't evil. This seemed to be a cherry-picked version of the libertine movement. The apothecary may have been a libertine, just not a very spiritual one. The apothecary left his wife in Haarlem, headed to Amsterdam, and applied for a voyage to the east. In appointing Hieronymus, the board made a rare move. He didn't have to work his way to the top. Hieronymus was a high-status, educated man who, being an apothecary, knew a lot about spices. His knowledge would be an asset to the company. Hieronymus would sail east a few weeks later on the company's newest ship, the Batavia. That leaves the captain. The company had already appointed a skipper to the Batavia when she was still being built. It was the highly skilled and experienced Adriaan Jacobszoon, a 40-something-year-old sea dog. Pelsart knew the man very well. The upper merchant had taken his journey home aboard the return ship, the Maagd van Dort, aka the Dordrecht, and Captain Jacobs was the ship's recently appointed skipper. Before the fleet even sailed, the two had a major falling out. Like most men serving in the East, Jacobs had become a raging alcoholic after spending 10 years in the exhausting climate of the Indies. One night in Surat Harbor, the skipper became so drunk that he gravely insulted Pelsart in front of the other merchants. The next day, the fleet commander, Commandeur Grijp, disciplined the captain in front of everyone. Jacob's behavior was unacceptable to the company, and he had to clean up his act so they could sail to the fatherland in peace. The captain blamed Pelsart for this very public humiliation. From that moment on, Jacobs resented the upper merchant, and Pelsart thought the skipper was an antisocial and disrespectful man. So this was gonna be fun. If Jacobs believed that having to tolerate Pelsart above him as upper merchant was unbearable, he was about to receive some fantastic news. Word came down that Fleet Commander Spex wanted to get married before sailing, and he was delayed, but the weather was taking a turn for the worse. The VOC made the unusual decision to split the fleet into two. 10 ships would wait and sail with the president when he was ready. The other 8, the Batavia among them, were to leave immediately. The 17 appointed the most experienced upper merchant available to become the commandeur in charge of the entire fleet, Francisco Pelsart. Jacobs was banging his head against the mast. As a result of the appointment, the Batavia became the fleet's flagship. The loading of the cargo and the boarding of passengers and crew took weeks. The Batavia didn't just need room for its crew, passengers, goods, and luggage, but provisions for a 9-month journey for everyone aboard as well. There were tons of cheese, sea biscuits, meat, herring, butter, dried peas, dried beans, and hundreds of barrels of beer and water. They also had livestock caged on deck and grew onions and carrots in the hold. Although the colonists living in the East ordered furniture, porcelain, mirrors, cloth like wool, velvet, gold, and silver lace, none of the local population needed European stuff, so the ship's holds were practically empty on the way in. To keep the vessel from toppling over, tons of heavy bricks were stacked in the hold as ballast. The Dutch used these bricks to build houses in the Indies or pave the roads. And then Governor-General Koen had ordered a 25-foot-tall gateway for the citadel of Batavia. It came in 137 pre-cut sandstone blocks to be assembled, IKEA-style, on location. And there was one thing the locals did want: silver coin. the common currency in the East. Just 2 hours before departure, one of the 17 personally delivered the Batavia 12 massive boxes with 250,000 guilders worth of silver, nearly 8 million in today's dollars. These money chests were not kept in the cargo hold, but with the captain in the great cabin. They were under constant guard by the soldiers. Pelsart bought 4 crates with the jewels with him. He had gotten permission from the VOC to sell them in exchange for a cut of the profits. The upper merchant's loot was valued at 60,000 guilders. Today, over $1.5 million. The total value of all the goods on board was 400,000 guilders. Never had there been a more valuable cargo on a VOC ship. It represented a fifth of the company's assets. So, that's over $11 million worth of stuff kept with a whole bunch of chronically underpaid people. You can see where this is going. The last people to go aboard were the captain, the undermerchant, and the upper merchant. Everyone else was already on board. The top brass stayed in the most luxurious part of the ship, behind the masts in the stern. They were separated from the rest of everybody who didn't have a high status. None of the regular folk were allowed behind the masts unless their duties called them there. The cabins were assigned by rank and precedence. The company spared all the expenses, again to maximize profits. The little rooms were Spartan, small, unheated, and barely ventilated. Skipper Jacob slept in the grandest room of the ship, the great cabin, to guard the treasure. It was the only place on the vessel that had windows, and it could be barricaded in case of a mutiny or pirates. Pelsart, Euronymous, and the upper and under steersman had private quarters. The other officers, like assistant merchants, secretaries, bookkeepers, and clerks, shared the space. Still, they at least had bunks and some privacy. The rest of the crew slept all over the ship on mats and in hammocks. The gunners slept on the gun deck between the cannons. The middle ranks, such as sailmakers, blacksmiths, carpenters, surgeons, butchers, and cooks, slept in berths in the forecastle or at the stern of the gun deck. There were dozens of cabin boys, some no older than 10 or 12, who moved all over the ship. They ran errands, brought dinner to the passengers, or emptied chamber pots. And sometimes, willingly or not, they served the officers in other ways. On board were also 100 company soldiers, mercenaries directly employed by the VOC. It was a random collection of men, some Dutch, some French, most German, and one Englishman. Imagine all the conversations they were not having. The troops were on their way to do a 5-year tour of duty in the East Indies. They were going to garrison the citadel at Batavia and put down any native revolts, like the one that was brewing with the Mataram Empire. During the journey, the soldiers protected the ship's cargo. If they were boarded or there was a mutiny, the soldiers would also defend the ship. They guarded the armory, where they kept all the muskets, gunpowder, bullets, swords, hatchets, and other weapons. No sailor was ever allowed even remotely close to the armory. Soldiers and sailors were notorious enemies, and so they lived strictly segregated to prevent fights from breaking out. The soldiers stayed on the orlop deck, which was part of the hold, a very cramped, dark space with a low ceiling. There were also 50 passengers on board. 22 were women, an unusually high number. Most of them were wives and children of the soldiers and crew. 2 high-ranking passengers upset the distribution of the cabins. The steersman had to move. One was 52-year-old Calvinist predikant, or Reverend Gijsbert Bastiaanszoon. He was a former horse miller in Dordrecht who had fallen on hard times after the introduction of windmills. Reverends were hard to convince to go to the Indies, as Calvinism isn't exactly known for its desire to spread the gospel. So, when Bastiaans offered his services, the VOC gladly sent him over with his wife Maria and their 7 children. Bastiaan 24, Judith 21, Pieter 19, Willemijn 14, Johannes 13, Agnete 11, and their youngest son Roeland 8. The whole family was packed into one cabin, along with their maid, Wijbrecht Klaas. The other special guest was Lucretia Jansdochter, an unusually beautiful and high-born woman from Amsterdam. She was on her way to join her husband, Boudewijn van der Meylen, an undermerchant for the VOC in Batavia. The couple's 3 children had died, and Lucretia didn't want to stay in Amsterdam anymore. She was traveling with her maid, Zwaantje Hendricks. No one was allowed to just roam the ship or even go on deck unless accompanied by a petty officer when they had a job to do or if they were on watch. It was too dangerous. The decks were stacked with lines, men repairing sails, carpenters sawing, and soldiers patrolling. There were also 2 boats stashed here, a yawl and a longboat. They would be used for trips to the shore. Weather permitting, twice a day, people were allowed to go on deck to get some fresh air and go to the bathroom. All in all, there were 341 people on board the Batavia, which comfortably held 300. There were rules on the ship, strict rules. The VOC had a ton of regulations of conduct aboard a ship and a punishment for each violation of these rules. The man enforcing them was Provost Marshal Pieter Janszoon, who represented both company and Dutch law aboard the Batavia. You were flogged for swearing, drunkenness, or urinating where you weren't allowed, for instance. If sailors fought and blood was spilled, according to Article 91 of the VOC rulebook, the aggressor would have his weak hand tied behind his back and his other nailed to the mast. He'd stay there until he ripped himself loose. Ouch. You were sentenced to death for refusing to obey an order from the captain, murder, sodomy, and starting a mutiny. A ship's council consisting of the upper merchant, the captain, the provost, the high boatswain, and the upper steersman would conduct a trial according to Dutch law and sentence the culprits for their crimes. There weren't many mutinies, but they did happen among frustrated crews. A typical sentence for a low-ranking mutineer was 200 lashes, enough to turn a man's back into pulp. Others were dropped from the yardarm. The mutineer's hands were tied behind his back with a long rope that was tied to a crossbeam. They were then dropped 50 feet, dislocating the shoulders. The process was repeated 3 times, with each fall more painful than the previous one. An even more severe punishment, yeah, it got worse, was keel hauling, a Dutch invention. The offender's hands and feet were each tied to the end of a rope, which had been fed under the moving ship, so it made a loop. The person was thrown in the water and pulled from one side to the other underneath the vessel. 3 times. In the early days, most people died from smashing into the hull or from being ripped open by the barnacles covering the keel. Since death wasn't the intended punishment, the ingenious Dutch found a solution: a special full-body harness. Since only 1 in 7 people could swim at the time, keel hauling was so scary that the full sentence was often not carried out. The victim could panic and drown, and they weren't supposed to die. Amsterdam harbor was too shallow for the massive return ships, so the fleet was assembled and anchored at Texel, an island north of Amsterdam. Escorted by the heavily armed man-of-war De Buren, the small fleet consisted of 4 return ships: de Dordrecht, de Schravenhagen, de Galliasse, and the Batavia. The Fluit, the Asse Delft, and yacht the Saardam were small trading ships designed for carrying smaller amounts of cargo between the Spice Islands. The Kleine David would ferry messengers between all the vessels in the fleet. The Batavia was by far the largest of them all. Once everyone was on board and they were ready to leave, there was one thing left to do. The Monster Commissioner, a high-ranking company official, would come aboard. He would check that each post was filled, read the ship's regulations and penalties out loud, and make the crew swear an oath of allegiance to the VOC. Then it was anchors away. The fleet left, but the Batavia stayed behind. Her draft would dash all the other ships against the shores. They left the next day, just after 9 o'clock, and would quickly catch up with the rest. But they had barely made it out of the harbor when dark clouds appeared on the horizon. A storm was headed their way. The storm was the Indiaman's greatest enemy. In the open ocean, a return ship could get swamped and roll over until the tops of her long masts hit the water. Once the sails made water, they would suck the whole ship down. Jacobs immediately ordered the sails adjusted, and it was all hands on deck. The boatswain had the trumpeters relay his string of orders. The crew was still green and untested, but the ship was more steady than most due to her sheer size and weight. The Batavia held just fine. They thought they were in the clear when one great burst of wind pushed the ship on the Walcheren sea banks just off the Zeeland coast. Being stranded was another great enemy of a return ship. She could come apart at the seams, or the waves could shift the ballast and the guns, causing the ship to topple over. Fortunately, they got stranded at low tide, and as the high tide came in, Jacobs' expert sailing skills got the Batavia free and clear, and the hull wasn't too damaged. The Batavia caught up with the rest of the fleet in the English Channel. The smallest return ship, the Schravenhagen, was badly damaged in the same storm that had stranded the Batavia. She had to return to port and be repaired. After waiting for a favorable wind at the Downs off the coast of England, the fleet got underway. It sailed past the coasts of France, Portugal, and Africa to the first and only stop at Tafelbaai at the southern tip of Africa. They moved at 5 knots, a brisk walking pace. But for some reason, the Batavia pulled into port at Sierra Leone. Stopping more than once was strictly prohibited by the company, unless in a severe emergency. Stops cost time, and time was money. Pelsart must have needed to do it because he risked a hefty fine. The sailors called Sierra Leone the white man's grave because it was infested with malaria and yellow fever. Perhaps they desperately needed fresh water or food. While there, they noticed a single white face among the local tribe. It was 15-year-old Abraham Gerritzoon, who had deserted from another East Indiaman, the Leiden, a few months earlier, and wanted to leave. Pelsart agreed to allow the boy to work his passage to the Indies aboard the Batavia. The fleet now entered the cart track, a wide band in the ocean they had to sail in. There was no wind on either side of this track, and veering off course meant they risked being dead in the water for months. As they were moving south, temperatures were rising and everything started to melt. The tar between the timbers, the candles, the people. Life on board was boring. There was not much to do if you were a passenger or a soldier. Things only got exciting when there was a storm, but that was sheer terror. The favorite pastime of all was gossip. The company did supply the ships with religious books for those who could read, or else for people to color them. The monotony was interrupted by mealtime, 3 squares a day that the crew ate in shifts. All food served on board was meant to keep a long time, and since they didn't have refrigerators, it was either rehydrated or super salty. For the common herd below decks, salted beef, pork, bacon, dried fish, apples and prunes, peas, beans, buckwheat, butter, olive oil, vinegar, and hardtack, the twice-baked bread. They washed down each meal with beer, brandy, and water. But a few weeks in, and everything was crawling with maggots, beetles, and other creepy crawlies that had to be scraped off or knocked out of the food. Beer started to smell funky, but it was still better than the algae in the water, which made it slimy and home to squiggly things. But it wasn't that bad overall. On land, people were lucky to eat meat 3 or 4 times a month. At sea, they ate meat 3 or 4 times a week. After all, they needed to be reasonably fit. In the elite part of the ship, mealtime was different. The top brass and distinguished passengers, such as the Reverend and his wife and Lucretia, ate at the large folded-out table in the great cabin. Cabin boys served the food, sometimes 10, 12 courses. They dined from plates, glassware, and silverware, all embossed with the VOC logo. They were served meat from freshly slaughtered chickens, pigs, and lambs, together with salads and vegetables flavored with spices, but also cheeses and dried fruit. They washed it all down with a fine wine or liquor. On calm days, sailors caught fresh fish. The skipper received the first catch, merchants and officers got the next dozen or so, and so on down the ranks. Most of the women on board were married to crew members or soldiers. Lucrezia was also married but alone on the ship. She attracted all the attention because she looked stunning, and like the temperatures on board, sexual tensions were running high. A proper gentleman knew to keep a respectful distance from this virtuous and married woman. Captain Jacobs was not a proper gentleman. He made it his mission to tempt her to his will and make her willing with gold and other means. Never mind that they were both married to other people. The captain felt that once at sea, all marital obligations went out the window. The lady made it very clear that she wasn't interested. Hieronymus, also married, didn't stand a chance either. Lucrezia seemed to get along fine with Bachelor Pelsart, though. While waiting for Lucrezia to fall for his charms, Captain Jacobs entertained himself with Zwaantje, Lucrezia's curvy maid. It was quite a scandal. Zwaantje readily accepted the caresses of the skipper with great willingness and refused him nothing whatsoever he desired. Since Zwaantje spent more and more time with the captain in the great cabin, Lucrezia didn't have a servant, and she had to make do without. The people working for the company had all sworn to uphold high moral standards, but the only one who could call the captain out for his lusty behavior was Pelsart. However, the upper merchant's health was failing, and he was confined to his cabin a lot, unable to attend dinner to put a stop to the captain's outrageous behavior. Out in India, Pelsart had caught fevers, and they always came back on poor food and lack of proper sleep. Eventually, Jacobs dropped Lucrezia altogether and focused all his attention on Zwaantje. The rejected captain started a rumor about Lucrezia to humiliate his new girlfriend's boss lady. Mrs. Prim and Proper went into Pelsart's cabin whenever he was feeling ill. Was she there to mop his fevered brow? Or were the two doing the nasty behind those closed cabin doors? There were even whispers that the commandeur was paying her for it. The whole ship was ablaze with gossip. March 1629. 18 weeks after leaving Texel, the Batavia reached Brazil and they caught the current east. They had celebrated the crossing of the equator in a big way. Double beer rations, concerts with dancing on deck, and the ship's crew were playing hilarious and often dangerous games. A few weeks later, the humidity was killer, and the sun cooked people alive, giving them horrible sunburn for which they had no creams. By now, the whole place was crawling with rats and insects like bedbugs, cockroaches, and lice. Lice could cause typhus, a disease that could kill up to a third of the people on board. Even the elite weren't spared this pest. They had to delouse once a week on the louse deck by the latrines. Some people went insane, unable to handle the vermin and the heat. Depression was not uncommon. 4 months after departure, the fleet hit the scurvy belt. Scurvy is a disease caused by the lack of vitamin C that one can get from eating fresh fruit. While they knew that citrus fruits were a cure, they didn't know why, and they believed that citrus fruit thickened the blood. The Dutch company's rival English company, however, always carried plenty on board. Someone suffering from scurvy suffered a long and agonizing death. A return ship usually lost about 40 people to scurvy per ship. The Batavia lost about 10, a pretty low number. The VOC had specific regulations for when people died. The upper classes' bodies were preserved by soaking them in gin, for example. Once back in port, they would be buried in consecrated ground. The crew was buried at sea. The people were sewn into their sleeping mat weighed down with a couple of bricks, so the body would sink and prevent the sharks from getting a nibble. The final stitch went through the fabric and the nose. It was a check to make sure that someone was actually dead. If there was no reaction, the body was carried to the main deck and taken 3 times around the mast. Sailors were a superstitious lot and followed this procedure to the letter. They feared that if they didn't, the dead could come back as a massive wave or a heavy storm. The Reverend said a few funeral prayers, the ship bell tolled, the drummer drummed, and the body was sent over the side of the ship into the waves. All the dead man's personal effects were auctioned off, and the proceeds went to the dead man's family. After nearly 6 months at sea, those aboard the Batavia spotted birds. It meant that they were close to the vast South African port of Tafel Bay, near present-day Cape Town. 2/3 of their journey was done, and they were a full month ahead of schedule. Table Bay was the only port for hundreds of miles and was a way station for the European ships en route to the east. A fleet would typically stay here for 3 weeks to restock, to repair, and for the sickest on board to be brought on land to recover. Everyone else had to stay on board. Pelsard, as the commercial commandeur, had to travel inland to trade with the Hottentots, or as we should call them, the Khoi, a local tribe of herders. He needed fresh water and meat for the entire fleet. Pelsard could speak Hindustani and Persian, but not Khoi, which sounded like whistling and angry turkeys, but he mimed, and mooed for cows and bleated for sheep. The Khoi didn't need money, so the upper merchant offered them trinkets, such as plates, fans, knives, small tools, and pieces of metal. The tribe really wanted the metal because they used them for spears and body decoration. In return, the commandeur got oxen, sheep, fish, and fresh fruit. The meat would be slaughtered on the beach by the fleet's butchers. The exchange rate was ridiculously in favor of the Dutch, but the Khoi were satisfied. It would take Pelsard days to secure the most favorable deal, and Jacobs was left alone. And he was like, "Party!" The captain and Zwaantje promenaded along the beach with Euronymous in tow. To get his booze, he rowed to the Saardam and got so drunk with the skipper that it turned into a brawl. The Saardam's captain, Jacob Jacobszoon, no relation, kicked him off that ship. The trio then headed for the Buren, the man of war, where Jacobs misbehaved even worse, and that captain kicked him off that ship as well. When Pelsard returned to the Batavia a few days later, he read the angry messages from the captains of the Saardam and the Buren about Jacobs. Pelsard got super angry. That idiot messed up again. He made him look bad again. The upper merchant summoned Jacobs to the great cabin and read him the riot act so loudly that nearly the entire ship could hear it. The audacity! The arrogance! First, the captain had gone ashore without his permission. Second, he disgraced the VOC with his shameless drunkenness. And then to top it all off, the captain of the flagship had been ultra-violent with the other captains. His behavior brought shame to him as the fleet commander. Jacobs was like, "Dude, chill. I'm too drunk to remember anything, and had I known you'd take it so seriously." Fuming with rage, Pelsard swore he would write a full report on the captain's dishonorable conduct. He would personally hand it to Governor General Koen, who would sort Jacobs out. It could end the captain's career, and this was his final warning. If Jacobs as much as looked at him the wrong way, Pelsard would take drastic measures. He didn't need to spell out what that meant. Flogging, maybe even keel hauling. The dressing down of the captain was big news all over the ship. When Jacobs finally emerged from the cabin after the humiliating scolding, Euronymous joined him on the upper deck. The captain fumed. "By God, if those ships were not lying there, I should get at him, so that he would not be able to come out of his bunk for days. But I swear that as soon as I go under sail from here, that I soon will be away from the other ships, and then I shall be able to be my own master." Wait, was the captain talking mutiny to a top VOC officer? Dude, don't! That kind of talk gets people thrown overboard. But Euronymous was curious. He asked, "How would you manage that? For the steersmen also have the watch." Jacobs answered, "That is nothing. I will manage it on my own watch." Euronymous wanted to know more about Jacobs' ideas and kept asking him for more information, but Jacobs was still a company man, As mad as he was about Pelsard, he would never move against the power of the VOC. He just grumbled. Besides, he was too old for this crud. But Hieronymus wasn't giving up so easily. This was a golden opportunity. He had nothing to lose and everything to gain. They were sitting on valuable cargo, and this captain could lead a mutiny. He'd be richer than Claes Compaen, the most famous pirate of their time. Praise be to God. He got the captain to realize that he too had nothing to lose and everything to gain. Once Jacobs got to Batavia and Pelsard filed the report with Koen, his career was over. Jacobs said, "I'm still for the devil if I go to Indian, then I shall get into trouble in any case." Gradually, the idea of a mutiny became a plan in Jacobs' mind. Mutinies were usually organized by the sailors and maybe involved some of the officers and VOC assistants. But if both captain and undermerchant were involved, this could work. Hieronymus and Jacob started having secret meetings to plot the logistics of seizing the ship and her treasures. Jacobs knew that the only successful mutinies had been pulled off on ships that were separated from the fleet. Then the upper merchant would have no backup from the other captains. So first, they had to separate the Batavia from the fleet. Second, they had to kill Pelsard and all those loyal to him. Third, they had to seize the ship and sail to a harbor out of the company's reach. They would have run to Mauritius to victual, and from there to rob the ships of the company until they should have become altogether very rich. All they needed were a few committed officers and principal sailors in key places. Once they had taken the Batavia, most other sailors would quickly join in. Then they'd have enough crew to sail the ship. Anyone who resisted would be thrown overboard, including the passengers, men, women, and children. Anyone who wasn't vital had to go. A mere 8 days after docking in Table Bay, the fleet continued its journey. Following VOC instructions to the letter, Jacob set a course east and hit the Roaring Forties. Once they arrived at the latitude of 30 degrees south, they would turn due north and head for Java. But now it was time to find the fellow mutineers. Though the punishments for mutiny were severe, it wasn't too difficult to find those willing to join the revolt. First, Jacobs approached his cousin, the boatswain mate, and then moved on to the high boatswain himself. The 20-something Jan Evertszoon was as powerful for those before the mast as Jacobs was for those behind them. The boatswain kept his men in line, and to manage that, he had to be brutal and decisive. He knew his crew of 180 well and could pick the ideal recruits for the mutiny. After hearing only the slightest details of the plan, Everts was in. Over the next few days, the list grew steadily, but we don't know how many there were. Only the captain and Hieronymus had the full list, and they never wrote it down. Obvi. We do know that Everts brought on Cadet Officer Gijsbert van Welderen and Gunner Rijkert Wouterszoon, aka Scarface, a loudmouth who clearly didn't know how to back away from a fight. Hieronymus found Gunner Allert Jansen, who had already killed a man in the Republic. Cadet van Welderen got his fellow junior nobleman, Cadet Officer Koenraad van Huysen, involved. Impetuous, hot-headed, with a lust for violence, Van Huysen boasted he would be the first to charge Pelsard's cabin and throw the commandeur overboard. Van Huysen quickly brought Cornelis Boontje Janszoon into the fold. The junior noblemen started sleeping with their weapons in their hammocks. Though it would be great to have Corporal Gabriel Jacobs in the gang because he was in charge of the soldiers, Van Huysen told the group to not even try. The corporal was there with his wife and dreamt of a new life in Batavia. They approached the second in command, Lance Corporal Jacob Pieterszoon, aka Stonecutter. On land, Stonecutter was always in for a brawl, and this was a brawl and a half. He accepted after cautiously being offered. Stonecutter recruited 2 German mercenaries, the colossal Jan Hendrikszoon and Matthias Beer. They had seen action in the 30 Years' War that was being waged at the time. It was a unique bunch. Mutinies were usually organized within a small group of sailors, but this one reached all the corners of the ship. Sailors, soldiers, gunners, merchants, and officers. Hieronymus even persuaded some VOC assistants to join in. Most importantly, he won a junior nobleman, David Zeevank, for the cause. Because of his privileged upbringing, Zeevank was handy with all kinds of weapons. The principal mutineers held secret meetings at night in the great cabin to further flesh out the plan. It was tricky moving forward. If the mutineers talked to the wrong man, they'd be dead. The biggest wild card was the soldiers. It was their job to protect the ship and its cargo from them. Stonecutter didn't know the men well enough to know which way they'd go. Everts had a solution. On the night of the takeover, they should simply nail the 2 hatches to their deck shut. Once the ship was secure, they would offer the soldiers a choice: mutiny or death. They decided to spare the passengers as long as they behaved and to drop them off on the first island or settlement they came across. But Pelsard had to die. If he was left alive, he could rally 300 against their 8 to 18. Then, the mutineers couldn't believe their luck. 2 days after leaving Table Bay, Pelsard became deathly ill. The upper merchant was sick as a dog and couldn't leave his bed. The 2 ship's surgeons, Frans Janszoon and Aris Janszoon, no relation, watched over him and tried to treat him as well as they could. It was difficult for these men to figure out what to do. The surgeons had passed their sea exams, so they knew how to treat any illnesses and injuries typically found at and around ships. But these exotic fevers that just came and went, that was a bit above their pay grade. They threw everything at the wall to see what stuck. Nothing did. Herbs, drugs, bloodletting, cupping, purging, or blowing smoke up his bum. Literally, nothing helped. Pelsard was not showing any signs of recovery. He kept slipping in and out of a coma. Frans Jans feared the worst. The man was dying. There was nothing left to do but to make him comfortable. The mutineers were not at all sad to hear that the upper merchant was at death's door. If Pelsard died, they wouldn't need to mutiny. With him gone, they would have control of the ship by rights. Hieronymus would then be the highest VOC official on board, and according to VOC rules, Jacobs would be in charge of the ship. Together, they were unstoppable. Hieronymus was like, "Thank you, Lord." With Pelsard out for the count, Jacobs was the unchallenged master of the ship. At mealtime, Jacobs sat at the head of the table in the great cabin, with Zwaantje sitting beside him, against Pelsard's strict orders. But no one was allowed to say or do anything about it. Without taking any thought of his honor or the reputation of his office, he said that if anyone made even a sour face to Zwaantje, he would not leave it unavenged. But oh, horrors of horrors, it appeared that Zwaantje was pregnant, and Jacobs couldn't have that on his record. He passed her on to Allard Jans in the most private room on the ship, the gun room. He served them the commandeur's finest wine and left them to it. Who's to know who got her pregnant now? Zwaantje didn't seem to care. But, false alarm. Phew. And the skipper and the maid were back together days later. Jacobs told her that she was no longer a servant, but a great lady. Zwaantje swooned. The Reverend was uncomfortable with the adultery happening right in front of him. Jacobs was a married man. But he was even more uncomfortable with the creepy apothecary sitting across from him. Hieronymus was using mealtime to share his less than godly views. He sounded so convincing and seductive that the men hung on his every word. The Reverend, with his limited yet strict Calvinist beliefs, knew the man was skirting dangerously close to heresy, and heresy was scary. If he only knew how godless, wicked, and cold the man really was. During this time, Jacobs managed to steer away from the fleet, possibly during a storm. They were now on a slightly different course from the other ships, which could not be seen anywhere. But then, 23 days after falling ill, Pelsard appeared on deck. The upper merchant was so weak that he could barely stand, but there he was, a resurrected corpse. Jacobs and Euronymous were stunned. He was supposed to be dead. This threw a wrench in their plans, big time. They had recruited 20 mutineers tops, not enough to take over a ship. They hadn't bothered getting more men, thinking the upper merchant would pass away soon. They needed more men, but how? Everts figured that they should get the crew mad at Pelsard. Then, more men would volunteer to join the mutiny. But Pelsard had been reasonable. He hadn't mistreated anyone, not abused his position, not called for the flogging or keel-hauling of anyone aboard. Any of those things would have created distrust and even hatred among a crew. The captain, Euronymous, Everts, and Zwaantje quickly threw a plan together. They would kill 2 birds with 1 stone. They would ruin the snooty Lucretia and force the arrogant Pelsard to punish the guilty, and because he didn't know who the guilty were, the commandeur would have to punish everyone. At the very least, the upper merchant would punish someone, with any luck, an innocent person. And bada bing bada boom, revolt. Euronymous thought that 2 men should cut Lucretia's face and disfigure her, but the captain felt the more people had to share the blame, the safer. Boatswain Everts recruited 8 men, saying, "Men, there is an assault on our hands. Will you help give the prince a pleasant outing?" Which means to have some fun. The next night, Lucretia suffered through another dinner with her servant-turned-lady, Zwaantje. On her way back to her cabin, she was suddenly grabbed from behind. A hand covered her mouth, muffling her screams. The nightmare began. It felt like 1,000 hands were lifting her skirts, grabbing her breasts, her legs, her womanhood. "Hold her legs, lads!" she heard someone shout. Then a sticky, stinking mess was rubbed into her face. Her hair, her clothes, her legs, her private parts, all over her body. The brutal attack was over in minutes, and she was found soon after, a miserable mess covered in a mixture of human waste and pitch. The entire ship was going nuts. A group of men had attacked Lucretia. It was an attack on the company itself. Pelsard, still very ill, was beside himself with rage. This looked bad. An attack of a high-born lady passenger on the flagship of the fleet while he was on board? The company would have him for breakfast. He had to punish the guilty. This could not stand. Pelsard let everyone know that he would stop at nothing to put all the crooks in chains. Our little group of mutineers was like, and here we go. All the mutineers were quietly supplied with swords and daggers and told to get ready. Boatswain Everts started working on the men. He told them that Pelsard was going to punish not only the culprits, but innocent men as well. However, if the captain was in charge of the ship, no one would ever be punished for what happened to whores. The captain had their backs. No worries. Pelsard questioned Lucretia in the great cabin. She told him she recognized Everts' accent and voice, but drew a blank on everyone else. The high boatswain. That was bad. Very bad. If he was involved, the captain was probably involved. There was no way Pelsard could arrest Everts so far from civilization. With the captain on the high boatswain's side, there'd be an open revolt, with no one left to control it. The upper merchant's first duty was to the cargo. He had to get it to port no matter what. If he arrested Everts, the cargo might never make it to Java. In the end, Pelsard figured that once they got to Batavia, the VOC torturer, who had a very special set of skills, would get the truth from Everts and force him to give up his accomplices. In the meantime, Pelsard did nothing. Jacobs and Euronymous were stunned. They thought of every possible outcome of the attack, but they never considered the possibility that the upper merchant would do nothing. They decided to wait until they got closer to Java. Pelsard would arrest somebody closer to port. If he didn't, the VOC would destroy him. If he didn't, they would move instead. June 4th, 1629. It was a little after 3 a.m., 3 hours before dawn. On the Batavia, the midnight watch was on deck. It was the most difficult and dangerous of all the watches. Men weren't always awake, and the working conditions were brutal. As was the custom, the skipper himself stood on the upper deck. Jacobs didn't think there would be any problems. There hadn't been any yet. According to the captain's latest calculations, they were still 600 miles from land. They'd arrive at Java in about 20 days. It was a clear night. The wind was blowing strong, and the ship was moving close to her maximum speed of 8 knots. Jacobs noticed something odd going on in the water dead ahead. Odd meant danger. It looked like the white foam of waves crashing into something, possibly rocks. It was the one thing skippers had to be on the lookout for. But it was hard to see it clearly. And with the waves crashing into the hull, he couldn't hear a possible surf. He needed someone else's opinion. I asked Hans the gunner, what can that be? Hans strained to see and concluded it was merely the shine of the moon over the waves. Yeah, that was totally it. The Batavia stayed on course at all sails and near top speed. Forward, forward, ever forward. Then a loud explosion, a growl of shattered rocks and splintered woods as the bow crashed into an immovable object, the force lifting the massive ship partially out of the water. The very tops of the mast simply snapped off, the rudder ripped away, and the hull shuddered from the blow. The Batavia went from 8 knots to a dead stop in mere seconds. All those on deck were thrown forward and to the left. Below decks, the sleeping crews and passengers fell out of their bunks and rolled off their mattresses. The gunner smashed into the 2,000-pound cannon, some of which yanked loose from their moorings and slid forward, crashing everyone in their path. Anything that wasn't bolted down flew through the air. Barrels, porcelain, glassware, bottles, books, chairs all crashed to the floor. Then the bow suddenly came up and everything and everyone hurled back, including those heavy cannons. Children crying, women screaming, men shouting and swearing. Lots and lots of swearing. On her maiden voyage, the Batavia had struck a reef.